So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Tough Talks Architectural Podcast. Thank you all for joining us today. I see we have quite a good number here today. There's 24 of us. That's wonderful, and thank you for being here. So, just to introduce myself, my name is Merylene Chitharai. I'm a professional architectural technologist, and I'm also part of the Tough Talks podcast team. I've been invited to host today's conversation as someone who's had experience in peace building and dialogue facilitation, and also conflict resolution through various interfaith and civil society initiatives. And it's been work that involves engaging complex issues, navigating diverse perspectives across difficult conversations. So I'm thankful to be here today, and I'm thankful to have you all here today. So I'd just like to briefly share the intention behind Tough Talks before we go into our conversation with our guest, Akheel Khan. The podcast emerged as a growing realization that many of the most important conversations affecting architecture and the built environment are often not discussed openly enough within the profession. So there are many complex tensions around technology, economics, ethics, sustainability, and the future of the practice. And Tough Talks was created as a space to engage these issues honestly, critically, and thoughtfully. And so our aim is not simply to provide answers, but to create meaningful dialogue and reflection around the deeper forces shaping architecture and society today. So for those interested, Episode 1 of the Tough Talks podcast is already available on YouTube. You can find it on our channel, and it features a conversation with Ilom and Tito, our other Tough Talk podcast team members. So I invite you today to listen with reflection, with curiosity, with concern, with inquiry, as we have a discussion after our podcast to delve deeper into the challenges facing the architectural profession around AI. And how can we transform the space for the betterment of the profession? The space will be open for you to share your concerns, your reflective thoughts. So stay with us till after the podcast and engage with us. And we look forward to that conversation. So let's go into today's conversation. It's titled The Death of Craft. Who really designs in the age of AI, right? This conversation explores the rapid changing relationship between artificial intelligence and the architectural profession. AI has moved from being something experimental and distant to something that is now actively reshaping how architects think, design, communicate, and work. But beyond the excitement and hype around AI, there are also deeper questions beginning to emerge: ethical questions, professional questions, environmental questions, and societal questions. And so today we'll be exploring issues around authorship, creativity, copyright, labor, inequality, environmental extraction, and whether AI is redefining architecture or exposing what remains humanly within the environment itself that is unique. So we'll be also asking difficult questions around who owns the AI generated design. Are architects unknowingly contributing to systems that may eventually replace aspects of our own labor? And does AI democratize architecture or centralize power even further? And what happens to craft, intuition, and human judgment in an age of automation? The intention of today's conversation is not to position AI as entirely positive or entirely negative, but rather to create space for honest and critical engagement around one of the most significant shifts that's currently happening and affecting architecture and society. And to help us unpack these themes, I'm joined by our guest speaker, Akheel Khan. So Akhil has worked within the high-level architectural practice environments, including Toyota, and he's founder of multiple platforms and initiatives within the built environment, for example, Cyberd, SACAP, and an architect. And over the past years, he has positioned himself very actively in AI and architecture, and he's done this through experimentation, implementation, lecturing, public engagement, and ongoing conversations around the future of the profession. So, Akhil, thank you for joining us today and welcome to Tough Talks podcast.
Mary, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be interrogated, as it sounds like.
Thank you for being here and thank you for being open to answering and delving deeper into all these difficult questions, right? And these are important questions because it affects our profession and society and our lives, right? So, Akhil, before we get into the difficult conversations, I think it's important people understand where your perspective actually comes from, right? What was the turning point for you personally in your journey where you realized that AI was just not another digital tool, but that was something fundamentally going to reshape architecture and the profession itself?
I maybe must give a little bit of a disclaimer here. Um, I am knowledgeable on artificial intelligence and I have done work in the field, but that doesn't qualify me to be an absolute expert. I do know more than most people, but the reason this has happened is twofold. I have a predisposition. Um, my family, from my dad's side, are all computer science based professionals, if you could call it that, professionals, because computer science isn't regulated as a profession. But that meant, as someone that was born in the very early 90s, that means that I was exposed to technology and the internet from a very young age. And so I have inherently a very strong understanding of what technology is about. Secondly, I will divide the subcategories into two. One of them I'll talk about my architectural journey, and the next I'll talk about how that sort of pushed me, uh, let's say, back into my predisposition. So I studied architecture at the University of Pretoria in the 2010s, and I was fortunate enough to have been exposed to the university environment, which, by the way, I always do support my School of Architecture. UP, Bokunda is an excellent school of architecture. It really cultivated critical thinking in me. And this shaped my worldview. But at the same time, um, I was also exposed to other worldviews. My wife and I had met prior to that, and my wife, in my opinion, is intelligent, right? Um, the most intelligent person I know. That's not for brownie points, but the way she's viewed the world greatly affected the way that I then inherently viewed it, and I was accommodating of various perspectives to really be in search of what it is that the world is about. And you might say that I was looking for meaning, and so as a result of that, I was also in a time of social activism. The fees must fall. I was actually there present at the union buildings when it happened, part of the people that got gassed, and it began to develop a sensitivity towards socioeconomic conditions. Um, I then, of course, got into the field of architecture after graduating in these times, and I began to discover the reality of the field. And I've actually been in the field of architecture roughly, if you look at the entire span of about 15 years. And in that time, I've seen quite a bit of change occurring. But one of the things that I think was maybe I was misinformed about was the economic prospects. Um, and that didn't necessarily matter to me at the time for a number of reasons. But one of them was that I was always under this false assumption, if you're good at something, the money will come. Now, I must also mention I have earned fairly well in the field of architecture, but comparatively, it isn't where I would have liked to have been. And then there were a number of things that happened throughout my life, and I say there were many difficult times during that period. And through that suffering, I found myself questioning a lot about the field. And some of the things about the field was it feels a little bit of a farce to me, the field of architecture, the built environment. And so I quite earnestly attempted to see if I could solve some of the problems of misinformation, of the challenges of higher education and not fully understanding where it's going, the gap between academia and practice. I tried to find ways to solve all of those problems. And because it came from a place of what I consider to be deep suffering, um, it helped me to find meaning to the suffering by attempting to solve those problems. And so I took it upon myself to help myself and find solutions to those problems. And when I evaluated all the avenues of where solutions could be found, technology seemed to be the way for me. So in the 2010s, I became aware of artificial intelligence and these motions. I was researching emerging technologies, which ones might benefit the field of architecture greatly to be able to position myself well. And of them was computational design, extended realities, and artificial intelligence. Those were the three that I focused on, but I knew about quite a few of them. There were about 8 of them or so. And from there, I knew my specialization would fit somewhere in those three. And so I began to start studying artificial intelligence. Actually, the correct term for the field where it belongs to is data science. And I started to actively engage in that. And in 2019, what was maybe a tipping point was I saw Revit had come through with a generative design. And I was like, well, I can see this is the path that I should be following. And so I actually intended to leave the field of architecture. That is what I was doing. Um, that was maybe, you could sum it up to that point of all these events that happened, the suffering, the economic decline of the field as a whole. And I was fairly good. In fact, I have been for most of my life a top achiever. I was never of the people that were not doing well. And yes, you might argue, yes, there were some times and maybe it wasn't at my best, but I have generally always been a pretty high achiever. And so I became a bit divorced from the illusion of high achievement, that there isn't meaning in recognition. There's meaning from deeper things. But anyway, I don't know if that really answered your question, Merylene, but the tipping point was 29, let's say from 2016 to 2019. Those years were quite formative for me in moving away from architecture into the tech industry.
No, that does. Thank you for sharing on that. It gives it a bit of a context to how you came into this field, but what shaped the conditions for you to get into AI. But I also remember when I was part of the PPE exam training, and you explained a little bit of how you used AI to create an architect to solve a problem in architecture. Maybe you can just share a little bit of that so our viewers can understand what led you to really explore the space a bit more.
So in 2018, I published my first book, or I think it was 2017. I actually had written my first book in architecture called What is Architecture? Understanding Architecture. And that also came from a place of deep suffering. Um, Studying architecture is really hard. And it was maybe one of the most difficult intellectual pursuits I've done at the time. Even though I was quite capable, I fully went into the field, and it was an extremely difficult degree that I had to do for me. And so I began to reflect afterwards. I actually left I left the industry at that stage, right? And I was in clothing design. I used to work for the largest supplier of clothing to Mr. Price. It was called Westside Clothing, and I was responsible for manufacturing, production, and design and R&D. I've actually been in the R&D space for as long as I've been working. And so from that stage, I then realized that technology was a solution to some of our problems. And talking about the professional practice exam, I was fortunate enough to have come across all these problems. And in my writing of What is Architecture around about 2017, 2018, I became exposed to the idea of technology being a means of accessibility. And so I had published my work in the US, and that work had spread across the globe. And I began to realize, oh, okay, so technology is an amplifier, and I could get something that was quite contained to South Africa or all over. I inherently knew this. As I mentioned, I grew up with technology. If I recall the late 90s, I was already sort of teaching myself things on the computer. Like I had educational games and learning English and mathematics, all of that, like how most people might use a computer now. I was sort of doing that in the late 90s. Again, I was quite fortunate to be in that position. But with that comes a responsibility. And so I could pick up patterns of benefit much quicker than everyone else. But it was the first time I experienced it myself, to be like, oh, something I made could get spread to the rest of the world very quickly. And so in founding an architect, if you look at the organization, the tagline is making architecture accessible, and primarily through technology, because technology is a means for accessibility. One of the things that had occurred, so there were many problems I was trying to solve. One of them was the professional practice exams problems. When I had written the exams, I was preparing for it for a while, and there wasn't that much assistance available. And I thought, what if we could scale that assistance? And so I attempted to create a program to do that and scale this. But what I noticed more the professional practice exam, it wasn't ever that somebody didn't feel competent. What happened is they lost confidence in the exam. And so we created what you might call a fine-tuned generative pre-trained transformer, or like a specialized version of ChatGPT, if you could say it in other words, that would not attempt to help you answer the questions, because that's what people go to it for. There's over 1,000 conversations, by the way, in this GPT. People going there to attempt to answer questions, but really what was happening, and this is maybe a thing we'll keep discussing as this conversation progresses, what was really happening is that they were alleviating anxiety. And that is what I knew we were trying to go for. Because if you had something to talk to continuously and give you answers that you could assess whether they were right or wrong, it's the act of the conversation that alleviated the anxiety. It's never really about the technology. It's about how you engage and how you feel at that time. And so what happened was I was actually part of SACAP's Professional Practice Examination Advisory Panel and part of the team, and I later on led the Professional Practice Examination. We use these methods of writing study guides, distributing it digitally for free to everyone, so everyone will have an opportunity to pass, putting out lectures and webinars for free for everybody in conjunction with SACAP. And then the GPT as well. All of these methods of attempting to help people increase the pass rate for the professional practice exam. I can't tell you definitively that was the only reason, but I would say that was a great contributing factor to alleviating anxiety so people could pass the exam. And that's one of the ways that technology and artificial intelligence were used. And I have since gone on to use artificial intelligence to solve many problems. I think that the confusion often comes that artificial intelligence is a general purpose technology. It's not, in my opinion, for automation, although you might think that. And so it's really important to know the problem you're trying to solve and then apply the technology. Automation and making it, let's say, auto-complete things is not a very wise way to use a technology. It sort of shows that you maybe have a misconstrued idea of what AI is about. But I'm sure we'll get into that later, and many people might ask those questions. But I don't know if that's sufficient as a question, Merylene, or as an answer, but
Yes, that
yeah.
is. I mean, it's important because it's opening the conversation to what I really want to ask you next, right? Because
Okay.
I've been exploring AI and I'm not sure how I feel about it. And there's many people, right? We're not sure about it. Sometimes it works for me, sometimes it doesn't. But my level of exploration has been the bare minimum, which is like ChatGPT and Google Gemini, Nano Banana, because I'm learning about renders and stuff now. And we've had previous conversations on generative AI and that how it's more than just a tool, right? So maybe like, for many people out there who's listening to us and many architects as well that really don't understand what AI is actually about beyond the image generation. Can you explain to us what is AI and what do you think that architects are misunderstanding most about AI right now?
You're giving me quite a tall order there, Merylene, but I'll try my best to explain it. And I can feel some of the pressure coming through now from the conversation, because a lot of what I say will potentially be taken as fact. So I'll mention again, you can always check this information yourself, and you always should. But artificial intelligence is actually an algorithm or it's software that, if you look at a full definition from Patrick Winston of MIT, who I think has the most useful definition, will say that it's used to mimic human thinking, perception, and action, which is a very strong contrast to what people say it's a tool used for automation. And I don't agree with that concept, because it's misleading and it's a very incorrect way of looking at it. Someone on LinkedIn some time ago mentioned, Akheel, don't you think it's a bit pedantic that you go on that we must stop calling it a tool? And I often say, well, if you say it is a tool, that is an attitude you have towards it. It's not the same as it being a tool. Like you might say, and I might say, Merylene, you are a tool for communication, but that's an attitude. Merylene is not a tool. Merylene is a human being, right? You are a person. So artificial intelligence are algorithms that to some degree you might consider to be self-revising, that when new information comes through to it, it updates and changes what it is based on the new information. And it's the first time we fundamentally have something like this. And this means that it changes the way we engage with technology. Because for the first time, you can put in an input, it can change what it is happening inside of itself, and then respond based on that. And it can do this and understand you in the language you speak. And you call that human-computer interaction. And so for anyone mentioning that it's a tool and it's for automation, you can do that. But firstly, I don't think you'll be very successful in that analogy going far, because you're going to be like, yeah, it's a tool to help me do my work. Okay, but like I just mentioned now with the profession practice exam, it wasn't a tool that I used. It was an anxiety alleviating method, right? That I use it for psychology, didn't use it as a form of working force, right? And secondly to that, if you say, okay, Akheel, AI is a tool for automation or whatever the case is, I'd be like, that is an attitude that you have towards it, and that might not be the most valuable use case. The most valuable use case I found for artificial intelligence is to pick up on insights you otherwise wouldn't have had. And that's a very basic statement to make, but it has incredible layers of complexity under it. You might know Demis Hassabis, who is one of the founders of, actually the lead founder of DeepMind, which is one of the firms that started this AI revolution in 2010. He says AI is a tool for scientific discovery. And I don't disagree with that. That's what he wanted to create, and that's an attitude, right, for it. When people say it's a tool, they really mean, and I've said this in many podcasts and in many places, they mean it's a means to an end. That's a more accurate representation of what you're trying to say. You say, if you, Merylene, are having this podcast as a means to communicate a message about AI further, then that's what it is. But I wouldn't go as far as saying you're a tool, because tools are predictable, reliable. You can continuously engage with them and expect the same results. Artificial intelligence is entirely based on probabilities, statistics and probabilities. That means it's not reliable at some stages. So I wouldn't classify it that way. These are metaphors that I'm trying to explain. I hope it gets to some of the point. But Merylene, I think that's what architects get wrong. They classify it as a tool and not as a general purpose technology, as Johan Fourie has mentioned and many people have mentioned.
That is very interesting to note. And I've experienced a little bit of what you said in exploring. I mean, take the basic of ChatGPT, right? Um, it actually engages with you and communicates with you. And it's more of a thinking partner, right? And I remember in our previous conversations, you said before, it's sort of like a means to mimic you and to engage with you. And that goes beyond what you're saying of it just being a tool, right? Um, so, Akhil, if you look at the profession, right, there's a growing
Mm.
anxiety as well in this profession. I mean, some architects are excited, others feel threatened. Many are quite uncertain about where this is all is going, right? And like I've had the experience personally, right, of being turned down for an architectural job because I was told that AI could do the task that I would be employed for, right? And so my services were not even needed, even though I'm looking for employment. So, from your perspective, is AI actually replacing architects, or is it exposing parts of the profession that were never truly valuable to begin with? Because if AI can generate concepts, renders, layouts, technical assistance, and automate workflows, what remains uniquely human in architecture?
So I'll very quickly discount some of what was mentioned there. Um, Automation, I mentioned, I don't think it's what it's for. What's happening inside a piece of artificial intelligence in its software is that when you feed it information, it creates what you might call a worldview. And you can listen to Anthropic's conversation on this called AI interpretability, or some people call it explainable AI. What's happening is you're putting data into a system, and it is attempting to create a formula that generalizes what it thinks you are saying, and then attempting to produce something out of that. And so with that notion, it's attempting to do that through formulae and calculations, and that you might say is automation, right? When it's repeating the same thing again and again, it's the same formulae being used. But as soon as it changes, you can't really say it's for automation anymore, because now it's changing the fundamental thing that automation is based on, that is reliability and continuity and replication, right? So I have to discount the automation part first. What Now that we know that, let's say it's not really as useful in automation, you might say, yeah, but it's generating concepts and ideas. Remember, I said it's mimicking human action. So in Patrick Winston's definition of AI, it's a much better definition than saying AI is a tool for this and this. It's like when you say architecture is the art and science of designing buildings. That's not really a helpful definition. But if you say artificial, that's more like a taxonomical thing, just to categorize it in the school of information. But if you say ontologically, like what is architecture, you'll say it is the physical realization of human ritual. That's more useful than it's art and science of designing buildings. Although that's not incorrect. With AI, if it is algorithms that simulate human thinking, perception, and action, you can see that it's attempting to get a computer to behave like you so that it can enhance a worldview that you have, or encourage different views that you otherwise might not have. It's simulating the so-called thinking part, right? It's not really thinking. It's gotten what you might call very good at picking up the pattern of what looks meaningful to you. It's not that it knows it. It's like when you and I in conversation, Merylene, and you lost interest in the conversation, you'll just say, okay, yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. Well, okay, cool, Akheel. I like your side of the story. You could say all those words without having listened to anything that I said. And I would perceive it as, oh, cool, Merylene is listening to me. Meantime, Merylene left the conversation ages ago, left the WhatsApp group, hey? So that's what AI is doing. It's found the correct words and things and sayings. It's learned the so-called patterns to express stuff to you that looks meaningful to you. But it's really just probability and statistics behind the scene. And so what's happening is you are working with representations of information. And what that means is it's showing you a concept generated, but it's a representation of a concept. It doesn't have the fundamental knowledge behind why that was generated. It has been derived based on billions of data sets put together and associations with this word looks like this picture and this picture looks like that word from labeled data, and it's producing what you might call a mix of or a montage of information that's being presented to you that you perceive as meaningful. But it's not that it's right or correct. These are statistical ways to map meaning to people. And that's also what draws me to it. Why are those representations meaningful? Someone might be lost at this point of the conversation, so I'll make a better point here. When you look at a Revit model, is that a building? Most people would say, no, that's not a building, that's a model of a building. If it's a model of a building, if you look at a picture or a drawing of a building, it's a representation of what a building is. I often open up lectures with Plato's Allegory of the Cave, where he talks about people and how people are watching their shadows on a wall, prisoners. That's what you're doing when you're working with AI. You're working with representations, shadows on a wall. You're not working with an actual thing. And so because human beings are wired to find meaning in everything, we automatically assume that AI has generated a concept, it's generated an output. There is no meaning behind that. You have to be the one that interprets that meaning and makes something of it, as sophisticated as it might seem. I hope that kind of answers your question, maybe in some part, but if it doesn't, let's clarify it further. Tell me where
Well,
the misunderstanding's in.
yeah, I think it answered it to in a point, right? To understanding it when it's used in architecture in terms of concept and renders and stuff. But
Mm.
what I really want to get to the crux of is that what it is doing to the industry in terms of a job security. Because,
Okay.
like, for example, me, I was turned down from a job interview because AI could do the tasks that I would normally do and I was not needed. So for me, I'm trying to like understand, like, do you think AI takes away job security and increases unemployment in South Africa, or it has the opportunity to allow us to redefine ourselves, our purpose, and our value in the profession?
I think what has happened is, firstly, people perhaps, with all of that, what I said, perhaps people have been misguided and under the illusion that your work is being taken away. When really what's been happened is you have a system that is able to cognitively amplify your thought process, or gives you, it levels the playing field. For example, if you were on campus and you had really good ideas but couldn't draw well, you know that the only way for you to get your ideas out was either by modeling it, but someone who could draw better than you could get a lot further very quickly, even though their ideas might not have been that great. So it gives power to a person that otherwise was struggling to be able to express themselves. It amplifies a person and their capabilities. And I would say in that case, that someone who might deny you a role perhaps fundamentally misunderstands the value that a person brings, or the value that an architectural designer brings. And I think that's because a lot of people define themselves by the tools they use. You're like, I'm very good on Revit, that is my value to the industry. I'm very good at these skills, that's my value. That, in my opinion, is not the value of human beings. The value of human beings is in good decision making and judgment. Um, and so if you are a person with 100 years of experience in the field, your ability to make good decisions and judgment is pretty on point. But artificial intelligence should help you expand that even further to say, here's all the things you didn't consider. And then you're like, oh, wow, well, maybe that is what I didn't consider. I could possibly go down that route. And so I don't think it's a matter of, is it going to displace jobs and am I not valuable anymore? It's you have to look at yourself differently. Whereas before someone might say, oh, your skill is in the actual task itself. Now your skill is in the ability to meaningfully engage with your work, really understand your work, make better decisions, but still have a knowledge of the technology. Remember, I said it's based on probability. So although we can so-called make models for you or do drawings for you, the power to see what is good and bad is really based on you. You might call it the human in the loop. So I think those are maybe bad ways to frame the question. And it comes from a place of scarcity and fear. And that's actually most of the time what underlies people's thinking. It's not that you are well informed on a subject, it's that you let your fear or insecurity or your whatever it is that you're feeling inside override the ability to think about it. And it's a completely natural feeling. But what happens is a lot of people then buy into this feeling and say, oh, it's going to replace my job. And for you specifically, Merylene, I think the person who you're working with probably was not looking for a person to work with. They were looking for someone just to execute tasks and follow rules and do less thinking. Um, when human beings are known for thinking, that's our like trait. And so I think that's maybe what happened. They maybe didn't value a thinking person, and that's maybe what they were trying to tell you. And it's probably better you didn't get into that job because they wouldn't have valued you in your entirety.
Yeah, that's true. That's true what you say, because it was more about saving cost and finding a tool that could do something and save more time and cost for them. It wasn't about your expertise and what you could bring to the table, right?
Mhm.
Um, so let's dive a little bit more deeper about the title of our conversation today, which is the death of craft, right? And
Right.
you know, architecture has been historically tied to like sketching, material
Yeah.
understanding, spatial sensitivity, and human intuition. And like when I look back at my campus years, I spent the first 3 years of campus, just studying visual communication, hand processes, learning how to sketch and form, the perfect letter, and presentation and design thinking. So I come from the old school of architecture where you always had the sketchbook and that was always with you, where you put your thoughts down, your sketches down. And I think this is where the conversation gets a little bit emotional for many architects, because when you hear the phrase the death of craft, do you think it's an exaggerated fear, or are we genuinely losing something important through automation or generation of images and everything that's technology, and we're losing the actual essence of what makes an architect through his craft?
Well, I think that's um, a question I have to answer in many ways, and I'm attempting my best to answer them from what I can share in the few minutes that we have together. Um, I have to bring about the idea of depth. Many conversations and ideas come from a place of insecurity, and that means shallow arguments. You would know that sometimes when you have a fight with a spouse and you start to shout at them, and you try to understand where did that come from, that usually came from you maybe haven't eaten, or you haven't slept for a while, or you felt hurt about something very maybe minuscule. And that's what's happening, is that a lot of people are coming to the table from a place of weakness, as if human beings are lesser than. And I'm saying, in order for us to have even created a technology that can potentially mimic us, we have to have been pretty worthy of doing such a thing. We have to have been full of value to have done such a thing. So for me, the framing already brings us into a bad perspective when you say, okay, it's the craft is dying. People have used the same arguments when CAD came out and BIM came out, and I don't want to get into those because those are also such basic arguments. You could figure that out yourself, right? What happened though with CAD and BIM is that we were, if you read some of the work of Mario Karpo, who's an architectural theorist, he'll tell you that that was more based on the act of automation of a task, right? Here we're not talking about the automation of a task. We're talking about the capacity to think differently. And so if you feel your craft is going to die because a technology comes about, then that means the craft wasn't actually in the thing you were doing. The craft was in the method in which you were thinking, because the new technology could come out and the same level of depth and complexity and richness that you brought to your hand-done task, if you take the same thinking and approach and apply it to the technology, you will achieve levels of refinement and complexity in that same new technology. This is true because if you look at a cell phone, it's somebody that thought deeply about the way we engage with human beings that has made a cell phone easy to use. If it was only the technology, there would be strange buttons in places you don't understand and don't know how to use it. But someone has thought deeply about how do human beings engage with things? What are things that appeal to humans? What is intuitively the way a human being would approach a phone? Someone that appreciated craft took the knowledge of that, applied it to technology, and refined the technology, which leads us to the smartphones we have today. So I don't think it's a very good argument to say it's a death of craft. It is an alternative type of craft we are getting into. The craftspersons will always be there. For example, you look at any of the software we're on, Teams that we're on now, for example. The way that it's laid out is a craft. Someone had to look at human user experience, the way that people behave. There's a craftiness. Same with Zoom. The same with many things. And so the way that often people use the analogy for software and architecture together, because they are greatly related. Human experience, the way humans experience things, is part of a craft, and we craft those experiences. So I don't think that a craft will die. I think it will evolve and become something else. Here's just another example. People say that it's text to image. I can just type a word and image can come about. If that was your value in drawing a thing from your mind to taking it out, if you thought that is your only value, then you will fall into an identity crisis, because you've entirely defined your whole life based on my ability to draw. I'll tell you that in my latter years of high school, I went into a crisis similar to that, because I thought my ability to draw, which was my you might say, gift from a young age, I think as long as I can talk, I know how to draw on its own. I began to have a bit of an identity crisis, knowing that I needed to build a life for myself. But does this mean letting go of this drawing thing that I'm able to do? And so that is a childish, immature way to look at yourself, that you are a one-dimensional person that only draws. Surely, as a human being, you are more than just the skill that you have. You are intellectual, you are spiritual, you are biological in nature. There are many things that define a person. What really happens is when people bring these arguments is they are afraid that they will be irrelevant, or they are concerned that the legacy they've been building their whole life suddenly collapses. I don't think that's a good enough, there's not a good enough argument for why technology shouldn't be around. That is, becomes an argument for maybe I am more valuable than I think I am. And that's a better way to look at it. Does that kind of give you a better direction, Merylene? It's a very difficult question to answer, but I tried my best.
Yeah, I think you highlighted a little bit of, like, the value lies in the human being, even though you are engaging with AI. But I mean, personally, in your own relationship, right, with to design, how has it changed with AI? Are you designing more, or you feel like you're curating more?
Creation is a good word, but I don't just use it for design. So I mentioned that it's a cognitive capacity expander, right? So I think a lot. And what happens is when I think, I don't always have the best ideas. And sometimes my worldviews are very narrow. And so what I attempted to do is I run through my thoughts as simulations. Some of you might have watched a lot of movies like Interstellar or even Batman, where it runs the probabilities of what could happen if you take this specific path. TARS is actually the thing in Interstellar. It's this little machine that gives insight. You got a 58% chance of survival or whatever. I think through my things very well. So I don't necessarily use artificial intelligence as an originator of ideas for me, because I have the ideas. I'm trying to evaluate if the idea follows this logic, what's the likelihood of success, what will happen. I also use it in my own personal capacity, in my own life. Sometimes if I'm trying to understand a scenario better, I'm trying to understand how did I respond to this in a way that was reflective of who I am. And so I will simulate various different trajectories I could have taken, and then evaluate it. Here's all the things I could have done. Did I still make the best decision, or should I now make a better decision? I use it for simulation of different things. And so that means I need to learn to make better decisions, because now that I can simulate, before I had to think it all through my mind, and that took me long, and I had to draw on many bodies of knowledge to be able to figure that out. which was a good experience in itself. But this sort of means now that the quality of engagement I have with the world and design improves. So let's talk about design in specific. I might be looking at a specific building and I might draw it out. And if I took a picture of it and I upload it to a large language model and I said, is it what are the variations of this that I could have? And it comes up with the variations. I can decide on my own whether that fits in line with what I want or not. That's not to say that what it's giving me is accurate or correct. It's exploring thoughts in my mind. And that's sort of the idea of thinking. It doesn't mean everything you think is correct. Because remember, I said these models, like a large language model, ChatGPT or whatever, it simulates the thinking process that humans have. When you think, it doesn't mean everything you think is correct. You have to decide. Many of the things you think are not correct. But that's part of the human experience. I must decide what is valuable and correct and truthful to me. It's the same thing with the large language models. I look to find value in what I'm using. But most people don't do it that way. They're attempting to use it to do a task for them. And that's where the problem comes, because when you get it to do a task, you're like, you did it wrong. What are you doing? But if you use it to look at the possible scope of opportunities that could exist, and you select an opportunity from there, now you've used it to think better. And I've often used it to have a deeper quality of thought. But my point is, sometimes it gives me answers that I otherwise wouldn't have expected, and that change my course of thought. Sometimes, Merylene, all it does is it takes out that early stage of nonsense I had in my head, and then now that I cleared out all the nonsense, the actual idea I was trying to get comes through. That's happened to me many times. I'll just give you a very quick example. I was trying to figure out what gift to get for my wife for her birthday. I'm not particularly good at getting gifts, right? Because I'm trying to find meaning in many layers. Anyway, so as the gifts, and I mentioned this at many of my conferences, what happened was it helped me get through all the rubbish ideas I had. And then because I did that immediately, the task came. I was like, I think you should book this experience for your wife. And that one won. That one was great. My wife loved that one. That had nothing to do with the machine giving me the answer. What the machine did is it helped me get through a stage which I couldn't get through because I was so stuck in my head about all the things that I thought she might like. And so I ran it through and simulated it, and then I was able to overcome the blockage. So a lot of people, I'd say for many things, even myself included, we think the thing we are using is for the task we want it to be. But the value is about everything around it. It's not really about the thing itself. Like I had the idea, not because I used AI, but it was a very nice byproduct of engaging with the technology to help me think better. And that is where the value, in my opinion, lies. Because these machines, in simulating thinking, help us to uncover things or reveal things that we sometimes wouldn't have thought about unless we had spoken to many, many people and then eventually gotten to that stage. Yeah, I think that's where the value lies in my answer there as well.
Well, I think I can relate a little bit to you because I was in a situation where I did this amazing design for this client and they never pay me. And even though they signed the contract, I still never get paid up to today. But I was in such a tiz about it. And I was so upset. And I had a conversation with AI and it just told me you're overreacting and calm down. So I used it to help me with my emotions. And I then produced a proper response to the client before losing my cool, right? So
But
I
but
would
I
say,
must stop you there very quickly, Merylene. That's a useful way, but it's also a dangerous thing, and we'll talk about some of those dangers as well as we get through it. But it is very useful, but when you don't fully understand how the technology works, it becomes very dangerous. But yes, go for it.
okay, cool.
Sorry.
We'll get more into that. Um, so let's branch out a little bit into ownership and copyright, right? And the
Yeah.
invisible labor around AI.
Yeah.
So, because one of the more uncomfortable aspects of AI is that these systems are trained on enormous amounts of existing human work, right? Drawings, writings, images, designs, and patterns, and often without direct consent from creators, right? So, but if you look at us now, when we were at university, architectural learning also involved studying, precedents and learning case studies and learning from the work of others through inspiration, from the great architects of Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier and stuff like that. So, where do we draw the line between inspiration learning and extraction? And when an architect generates work using AI, who actually owns that design? Is it genuinely original, or is it a sophisticated remixing built on uncredited human labor?
You framed that so difficultly to answer, so I'll try to unpack that, Merylene, because in the way that you've asked the question, you've had both positive, extreme positive and extreme negative. So let me try and get to the answer. Um, I have co-founded an institute that currently exists under Cyber as a subsidiary of Cyber, the South African Institute of Building Design. It's called the Institute of Building Design, and at the Institute of Building Design, one of the taglines we intended to have is called "In Truth Towards Prosperity." Now, this is it's not an official thing yet. We're trying to figure it out. So, I'm going to attempt to give you the answers in truth to the best of my knowledge. So, artificial intelligence was trained on what is available that has been collected on the internet. And that has been over the course as long as the internet has been in existence, in whatever formats that are available to be accessed, whatever is accessible easily on the internet. And so that means that artificial intelligence is to some degree a mirror of the things we have been doing all this while. With that said, it is generally quite common knowledge to know that if you put out something on the internet, your pictures, your work, whatever it is, it immediately doesn't belong to you. It belongs in the public domain, right? And so already just on the start, it's a tough conversation because most people should know that when you put something on the internet, according to the law, it doesn't belong to you anymore. And so that's already the first place that this conversation gets complicated. The next one is, say that, okay, that argument is fair. Everything on the internet belongs to everyone at all times. Then it means any company can use that data to do what they please with it. And that's, of course, why a lot of people have been over the years very cautious about putting stuff on social media. You're putting a picture of yourself and your spouse or your child and saying, here we are, because that information doesn't belong to you anymore. But let's say all of that is accepted, that cool, you put it in there and it belongs to the world. Then these companies technically have not done anything wrong. And so what they have done is they have taken that data and transformed it into something that resembles the pattern of what that data is about. That's technically what happened. So let's say you are upset by this. Let's explain it from the person's perspective that they're upset. You took my data, and I can't believe you did it. You didn't ask me permission. Let's say that is the truthful case. It's really important here to have a technical understanding of what's happening in artificial intelligence because it helps you set the idea further. It helps you get a defined argument. Now, the reason I know this information is twofold, because people usually trust you because of what you know and what you've done. I know quite a bit and I have done quite a bit. So the reason I know a lot about artificial intelligence, apart from the predisposition I have mentioned, that doesn't qualify. I mean, it doesn't mean just because your family is in a thing, you know it. I actively studied artificial intelligence or data science formally and informally. The informal part of my studies was deep learning. And so I found all the information I could about deep learning. Deep learning is a subset of artificial intelligence that I'm going to explain now. So in deep learning, which is all of the AI we are using so easily accessibly today, deep learning allows lots of data to be contained in a system, and it tries to pick up patterns in that data, for lack of a better word, and forms what they call a worldview on the pattern. So it's a generalization of the data there. It means that if someone put up a piece of their work, and someone else in your field put up a piece of their work, and someone else in your field put up a piece of their work, it takes the average of all of those things that are, let's say, an approximation of all of those things to figure out what it is that you were doing. So if you didn't upload your work to the internet, but 1 million other people did, it'll figure out a pattern of what architectural work looks like anyway. It's very unlikely that your very small contribution would have changed substantially what the worldview of what AI thinks architecture is. Because remember, it's trained on entire human collection of information on the internet. A lot of that information that's on the internet is free. It's not for anyone to pay for example. It's there for human benefit. And so as it is there for human benefit, we now start to think, okay, it's a world model. It creates an approximation of whatever is on the internet, and then it produces something that it believes to be in line with that worldview. Let's say believes in that way, because it doesn't really believe anything. So the output is produced is an amalgamation of what it generally thinks architecture is, because it's like if you drive past a house and you see all of these houses, most of them look a specific way, you make a generalized view that, oh, these are Cape Dutch houses and this neighborhood has full of Cape Dutch houses. While that might be somewhat true, not every house is Cape Dutch. And not every house might have been built at the same time in the period of Cape Dutch. One might be a copy of Cape Dutch, not actually. And so that's what's happening with the data. It's creating a generalization. That's not very different to you potentially looking at, hey, I like the work of Frank Lloyd Wright or Dr. Sjaba Mape or whoever it is, and you being influenced because you took the elements of their work and created it. Because that's what artificial intelligence is doing. The idea that it's garbage in, garbage out is an automation paradigm that exists in a mechanistic worldview of how machines used to be before. Machines now are able to generalize information and produce based on a generalization, not based on your work specifically. It doesn't take what you have and spit it out. That's what automation does. Garbage in, garbage out. Good stuff in, good stuff out. Probabilities don't do that. Probabilities try to find patterns, generalize those patterns, and then produce an outcome based on it. Also, at the architectural level, the system level of these machines, they produce unique outputs every time. That's what they are architecturally meant to do. You can see this whenever you put a prompt in ChatGPT or whatever. It produces a different output every time. Even if it might look the same to you, it's different, maybe in paragraph, maybe in structure, maybe in syntax. It's the same thing with images. It's different every time because architecturally, that's what it's meant to do. Remember, I said it's meant to simulate human thinking, perception, and action. When human beings think, perceive, and act, they don't ever do the same thing twice. And that's what these machines do. There's a little function in there called temperature. It's a randomizer. It means every answer you'll get will be different, and that's what makes it unique. So it's a thing that produces unique outputs. And now that gets you a question. Okay, if it's creating unique outputs, Akheel, who does that belong to? That's a very tough question to answer. But I'll say, if you were influenced by the work of Frank Lloyd Wright and you built something that is somewhat similar to his or lives in the same likelihood, do you have to pay Frank Lloyd Wright for that inspiration? Right? And that's the influence that he has. And maybe the answer is yes. I don't know. Maybe we all should be paying Frank Lloyd Wright for the inspiration and influence he's given us. But that's essentially what the computers are trying to do. They're trying to mimic how humans create things by following the processes we generally come up with through statistics. So that's why this argument's very hard to say who owns it. I don't know who owns it. I don't know what's the right answer to that. Probably the person that is the one that guided the model to create it. But I can't say that it belongs to everybody because then it's so difficult to pinpoint what came from where, because this is billions of data sets and parameters in these models. That means everybody in this world must get compensated for whatever contribution they may or may not have had, because it's almost impossible to tell where it came from. That's a really long answer, Merylene, and it's a bit technical. I hope you followed.
I do. I mean, it's giving food for thought, but I think maybe I want to know. So, say for example, would you say the safer way to use AI is, for example, rendering? If you came up with a design, you built a SketchUp model around it, and you plugged it into an AI render, you can safely say that that design belongs to you, and you are the owner, and it's copyrighted to you. I'm trying to find a practical way to understand it as well.
Here's something that you should know. Artificial intelligence as a technology can be used by anyone. What's happening is everyone is using it on the cloud, and it's being used on the cloud by massive corporations, right? And so what happens is, and you might not know it, but your data that you are putting into the machine is being used to train those models. And if they are being used to train those models, then their systems are getting better because of the data you are putting into it and your work. If you don't want that to happen, you need to have localized systems. And that's the argument that I would say is the preferred argument, that if you want to use artificial intelligence and you are very concerned about data, then have the technology itself live on your computer. They call those local models, localized models. It lives on a server or on your laptop. And that's what you should be advocating for if you are very concerned about your data. If you're not that concerned about your data, then you should use OpenAI's ChatGPT, Anthropic's Claude, and the rest of them, because none of them are not capturing your data. It's It's a bit of a fallacy if you think that your data is not being used. And that's part of the dangers, Merylene. You might become so easily susceptible to talking to a machine the way you would to a human that you give in a lot of information, and that data can be used for your benefit or for your detriment. And so I'd say here's a rule. If you cannot say it in public, do not put it in a large language model that exists in the cloud. So if it's on the internet, if you want to use a large language model or an image generator, because it's not really rendering, it's a visualizer, it's mashing up images together. Rendering talks about the simulation of light over masses. That's a physics thing. What's happening here is it's not rendering, it's visualizing stuff based on many pixels being amalgamated together in a denoising process. If you want to do those things, use local versions on your computer, and you'd have to do that, you have to have someone that can help you do it, or you must understand it yourself. And that's why it's really important for people, in my opinion, to have a general understanding of AI and AI literacy, which is what we do at the Institute of Building Design. We provide AI literacy to people so that you don't sell your soul away, because it's a general purpose technology. It doesn't belong to Google, doesn't belong to OpenAI. And that's why the Elon Musk and Sam Altman trial is going on now, because they said it's supposed to have been for the benefit of humanity. Why is it now a for-profit organization? And that's a whole one of the premises of it. In summary, your concerns about data can be solved if you do it locally on your machine, because then you're just using the algorithms on your machine. As soon as you connect to the internet and to the cloud, your stuff goes everywhere else.
I think that's very important what you're saying, and it's very important to note. And as you said, it can be quite dangerous because if you're putting really sensitive data into it, into an open AI system, you could, land yourself in a lot of trouble as well.
Yes.
So I think that's very important what you said for us to understand that. And then, to talk about a little bit more about AI in terms of exploitation, right? Because I know that we did discuss this a little bit previously, but we spoke about the psychological aspects of it, right? And
Mm.
hallucinations and stuff. And we spoke about like what happens where there's an invisible labor force behind the AI. Maybe you can share a little bit about that so that people could understand a bit more, especially about I remember you saying that the labor aspects in Kenya and what they have to go to sift through the data and the human aspects behind the actual technology.
So artificial intelligence exists in a number of layers. So it's not like you just have stuff that you see on the cloud. There has to be a very real physical component to it. And so that's infrastructural, like data centers and servers. Then there needs to be the data that goes into it to feed the system, and the environmental resources around that, like water and electricity. And then after it's trained the system, it also must be deployed. And so then you have these applications that are making use of all of these models that are being trained on. So you get a model, um, which is like a large language model, is a representation of how human beings use language through an algorithm. So we call it a model, right? These models, you can have a vision model that is a representation of how human beings see things expressed through algorithms. You can have a sound model, whatever the case is. These models that are being trained. Also, then you have to use electricity to be able to get it into households or into people's computers. And then you have the application layers, which are the actual interfaces that you have. So there's actually a number of layers, and it's if you read more about AI, you'll see there's a lot of layers behind the infrastructure and how it gets to it. So the part where we are talking now in that chain of systems, we're talking about the data produced. In order for artificial intelligence to be processed correctly or to be beneficial, it must have what you call structured data. So structured data is like if you take a picture on the internet, it must have a word associated with it. So if it's a picture of Merylene, it must say Merylene. If it's Akheel, it's Akheel. This is how a model knows that Merylene, the word, is related to Merylene, the person. And we do this many times with many, many representations, right? And so the thing that I would appreciate um, the most about this whole discussion on AI is the models that we have created are based on data that has been labeled by people, and that generally happen on the internet every time you put a picture somewhere. But what's not really mentioned is a lot of the efforts that have to go in to make these models accurate. And so you have to have a person that goes through all of this content to check if it's correct. We'll call that the human in the loop. And so with the human in the loop that we're referring to, what I would think is an important thing to take note of is it has to be people that do that. And when people do this, they have, and it has been the case that this is called AI colonialism. Because what happens is people of the global north attempt to use people in the global south, Africa, India, and the rest of the world, and attempt to use these people to do that labeling for them at a very reduced fee. The problems that came about in Kenya in specific is that when they did label these things, and these massive AI labeling companies or data annotators, you might call them, they don't remunerate the people well, but they also expose them to very terrible content. So in order for you to not get a naked person when you generate images, is because someone went there labeling this is what naked people look like, and they had to go through thousands and millions of images to do that. That creates a psychological effect on people. That means you have to look at data on the internet that is about rape and murder and violence and a whole lot of other terrible things. Someone has to go through that and label that and say, this is it, so that all of us can benefit and so that we don't see that and our kids don't see that. And people are not provided with the emotional or psychological support for that at these corporations, and they're also not remunerated fairly for this. That's not an AI problem, because that's a manufacturing industry issue as always. You might see an iPhone is manufactured in Thailand or wherever it is using child labor, for example. Or you might see that someone is producing cars and the places where it's come from is exploiting resources in other areas. The issue is not that you shouldn't have the car, it's that you should have more responsible processes, support the people that produce the car. So that's fundamentally not an AI problem. That is fundamentally a people governance problem. And that's what I think people are going for, better governance and regulation over these things. Does that make sense to you, Merylene?
Yes, it does. And I think that's very interesting on what you touched on because I've read a book called Confessions of an Eco Sinner, and I would recommend every architect to read that. And basically, it's this guy who tracks 5 elements from his house. It was coffee, it was his wedding ring, it was chocolate, it was his t-shirt, and there was something else. And he traces the carbon footprint behind it and the processes involved. And he uncovers this whole industry of like, how waste is produced, right? And how that the cotton t-shirt that you're wearing that you buy in a shop is actually child labor in Bangladesh, or that waste is shipped from European countries to countries like Bangladesh and India and dumped there because that's how the system of waste is produced with like, plastic islands and stuff. So I think it's interesting what you're saying because it's actually challenging and putting highlight on the global systems that are in place created by human, right? And we have to take responsibility in how we govern these things and regulate these things because it affects society on many levels. So going back to exploitation, right? We spoke about the environment. And, people speak of AI as innovation, but very few people speak about the extraction of it. And so, as we mentioned, behind AI are massive data centers, energy consumption, water usage, mineral extraction, hardware waste, and the invisible labor, right, that's supporting these systems. So, at the same time, supporters of AI argue that these technologies help to accelerate climate solutions, optimize systems, and create more sustainable futures. But how do we hold these contradictions honestly? Because do you think the architectural profession is engaging critically enough with the environmental and human costs behind AI infrastructure? Or it's a contradiction in architects pursuing sustainable design while increasingly relying on technologies with heavy environmental footprints? Because it feels like hypocrisy at some point.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from, Merylene. So architecture's relationship with the natural world is a point of contention for almost all architects. It's the best thing to do is to not build, right? That is a solution to architecture's problems if you frame it as though everything we are doing is destroying the planet, right? And so then the alternative to that is, okay, build more responsibly. Okay, so building more responsibly means you must have a deep knowledge of the ecosystems and work within it. But even then you risk potentially damaging some of the ecosystem that is already there, because we might have knowledge, but our knowledge is as limited as the technological projections that we have. or progression that we have. For example, without the microscope, we wouldn't have been able to see many things or know of many things that exist. Without the ability to understand medical sciences any better, we wouldn't know what some of those problems are. So, like, technology helps us to see ourselves in greater lights. And so it's a bit of a tough relationship. You have to create technology to better understand the environment, but you must use the environment to create the technology. And it's a cyclical thing. But I'll say it in this way. I think a lot of the issue comes around data centers and electricity and water being used for it. Data centers definitely use electricity. They use, maybe some narrations say, from 5 to 11 times more amounts of power to train these AI models. But with that said, it's not just electricity that's a problem, which is a massive problem in South Africa, as we all know, but it's also water that's a problem. So the water that's needed to be able to cool these centers is where massive water consumption comes in. And that's where many people say, but we don't have water and now we don't have electricity. That's a terrible thing. It definitely is a terrible thing if you look at it just in that capacity. So data centers, when it comes to electricity, if we found different ways, renewable sources to do it, to be able to power these stations, that's part of a problem solved. But then you're like, okay, yeah, but Akhil, water, just use the water to cool it. We have to cool these systems. What many people don't know is that there are data centers that use the same amount of water input to continuously cool it. It's a closed loop of water. So it's not more water going in. It's the same water being used to cool the systems every time. You can also use other alternative methods, like if you had a data center under the sea, then you really sort of displace the whole cooling factor because it's pretty cold in the sea. Or like what many of the large companies intend to do, put data centers in space. And yes, I'm sure there'll be some sort of impact, but not as great as having it on the Earth. And then you might talk about the resources for these, like the chips, which are rare materials. We are going to most likely be producing computers because it allows us access to talk to each other in different locations for a long time. I think what happens is the technology will heighten our ability to find alternatives because so many people want to use it. They will invest more resources in finding alternatives for renewable energy. I think we might have a stronger race towards renewable energy. And maybe I'm wrong, right? But here's an example, a very good example. The cost of human life, one human life lost, is as great as losing the whole of humanity, generally speaking, for people, right? And so what artificial intelligence has done by Demis Hassabis, who I mentioned from DeepMind, his whole idea was to use artificial intelligence to help us accelerate scientific discovery to improve health of people. And one of the things they did is they solved the 50-year grand challenge on proteins. And AlphaFold, which is one of the artificial intelligence platforms they created to predict protein structures, is able to help us and will help the rest of the medical profession for an extended period throughout time solve the problems which relate to human health through the use of artificial intelligence. If we save only one life through that, that is sufficient to say that we have used the resources that we've had to help human beings. Now, I would say that the benefit of it, if we are able to use artificial intelligence, which already is used, by the way, to improve efficiency in electricity grids around the world, to what extent? It's a minimal extent, but it definitely helps if we can use it to improve our energy efficiencies or our energy usage or consumption, or find alternative methods and safe alternative methods, whether it's from nuclear or whatever it is, that will be able to fundamentally create clean energy for everyone. And I think that is a potential, because I don't think nobody thought that artificial intelligence would help us in the 2010s to solve a 50-year grand challenge in biology, which it has. And even if you told someone that in 2015, they wouldn't believe you because they say this is a nonsensical thing, but it has happened. And so I think it might be very shallow-minded of me to say that we've got to stop progress with any technology because we don't know how to use resources effectively. Then you must learn to use resources effectively. I don't think you should stop progress for that matter. But again, it depends on what you define as progress. But that's my take, and that's a long take, Merylene.
Yeah.
That
No,
situation.
well, I think it comes down to responsibility, right? So if we have more education and awareness around the the consumption that goes behind AI, people will actually use it more responsible and use it in a more better way, I think.
Yeah.
So this brings me back to one of the concerns about inequality, right?
Yeah.
Um, so like, most the firms with the most access to AI tools, computing power, and technical
Mm.
knowledge gain massive advantages over small practices and emerging professionals. So, do
Right.
you think that AI democratizes architecture or it centralizes power even further?
I think if your view on artificial intelligence is that it's a tool, you will fail, in my opinion, to be able to make the best use of the technology. And you will also be behind a lot of people that think in more clearer ways than you. If you attempt to use it for automation or to replace people, I think that will also fail you in the long run. Maybe the only thing I can think that's been automated properly is creating software, and maybe if you look at it, the ideas are actually inverse to that. Sorry, the employment is inverse to that. People do hire more software engineers now to be able to manage these systems, even though their job has been greatly automated. But let's take it from this way. Merylene, you go to an office, you have the keys to open the office door. You get to the office, the phone is ringing, you answer the phone, you respond to a client, and you know that the client had a problem. You're like, don't worry, we'll get to it. You get to your desk, you put the computer on, you start to work on your projects, and then you have some plans that you've got to mark up, you've got to take that to the municipality or whatever the case is, and you have a whole day of going to site and making sure things are correct. There's a lot of that that cannot be automated, that are just physical things that you cannot automate. So to say that you want to, you as a firm might be behind because you're not using AI, I think is not really a true statement, because a lot of the things you do every day is just not an automated thing. It needs human beings to open that door, human beings to put the lights on. You might be like, yeah, but we can automate all of that. Yeah, but the cost of that is pretty high. Not everyone can afford to automate all of those things, like put lights on and do stuff like that. The cost is relatively high. Economically, it's not possible for everyone to do that. But then secondly, when you use artificial intelligence genuinely to help you think better and to find alternative outcomes from a strategy perspective, then I think you'll move very far. I'll give you an example. A lot of people are trying to automate the actual thing that architects do, which is cool and stuff. But at some stage, that probably might inevitably happen as humans progress. What I think is a better way to look at it is you start with the problems. So you say, for example, in my firm, what is really difficult is figuring out when is the next work going to come in. If you strategically look at your company's data and use the data and you try to use a model to pick up on patterns of when we got work and ideas like, okay, where is there a building boom coming up? Where is there a migration of people? Where can I see people have qualified for new home loans? Now, this obviously gets into data privacy and banking detail or banking information, but if you're able to look at data that's generally available and start to pick up, oh, if there's schools around here, that means there's families around here, and potentially if we know that from a hospital there are more births that were there in the surrounding areas, people might want to be extending or renovating their homes. If you get that data and you start to look intelligently at the system, when I say intelligently, I mean here not artificial intelligence, I mean intelligently with insight, you start to say that's where my next clients will potentially come from. And if you had a system that picks up on this data and says, oh cool, that's where new developments are coming from. Oh, if a new house is being developed there, that means somebody, or new houses, people will need groceries, people will need clinics, people will need better infrastructure. You can be the architect that approaches the people that have the funding or whatever the case is and say, hey, when you are ready, we are here. Here's even a very quick proposal of what could potentially occur. And you just give them a very high level overview, nothing in depth that costs so much of your time. But you now are starting to foresee solutions before the problems actually occur. And now you can create a pipeline of work. That is what you can use artificial intelligence for, to help you predict future states and make decisions based on that. Because yourself today is based on is informed rather on the future that you want to live tomorrow. And so if you can get some sort of insight of the future, you can start to change your life and the things you're doing today. I say that's a much more useful method of using artificial intelligence to solve problems. Like if we have financial problems, that's it. I mentioned a few others like reducing anxiety. And these kind of things are not automation of your workload. They are around it, and they are things that contribute to you doing your tasks well. Many people say, yeah, someone AI won't replace you, but someone using AI will replace you. Those are really superficial ideas. Those are like zero-sum games. Those are silly arguments, in my opinion. We are the intelligent ones. We are the ones that are supposed to figure out much better uses of this technology. But the reason why we don't is because we're sort of trapped in this idea, a mechanistic worldview that's born out of the Industrial Revolution, that machines just operate independently. This is a thing that enhances the human experience, and that's the way, at least, I would like to view it. And I see a lot more value in that than can AI do my BIM models for me? Can it draft a drawing for me? Can it come up with a render for me? I don't think that's the point of the technology. That's a very nice byproduct, but you have something much greater than that that's in existence. Does that make sense, Merylene?
I think that's interesting what you're saying because, one of the things like I've learned, like, you have to really reflect and define who you are as an architect. Because usually we are seen as problem solvers, we resolve conflicts, we come up with innovative ideas that could change society and transform society, not only the profession and the industry, but people's lives, So I think that's important what you said, in that to really reflect the kind of architect we want to be, because we're not just here to just produce submission drawings and just well, we need it for the bread and butter, the everyday life situation, right? We also
Yeah.
here to transform, like the whole society, make
But
things better.
Merlin, on that point, imagine if you could figure out where your bread and butter is coming from for the next 5 years. You don't have to worry about survival anymore. You go into thriving mode because you're like, I know I'm set for the next 5 years. I have an economic engine that's going to support my firm, pay my staff, get my salary. I can now focus on the transcendence, which is what most people, especially in the global south, argue. We've been exploited so long that we are in a survival state. But if you get survival going, immediately, I'll tell you, when I first started to earn a slightly higher salary, my mind just opened up. It's like, wow, I can save. I can get a retirement annuity. I didn't know those things were going to be possible for me because I was always in survival mode. And if you're always in survival mode, you'll never be able to think higher. And so this is an opportunity for us to figure out how can we get a baseline survival so we can thrive as people. Sorry to interrupt you there. I thought that was an important point to make.
No, that is important. I mean, that's true, because once you're not in that survival mode, you can actually problem solve the challenges of society,
Yes,
whether it's
yes,
climate change or resilience in sustainable architecture. You can always push the boundaries and go further, right?
yes.
So just coming back to a little bit about in the South African context, right, where spatial inequality already shapes much of our reality, could AI unintentionally deepen divisions both within the profession and within the built environment itself? Because one of the strongest counter arguments I encountered was the idea of platform feudalism. I don't know if you know about that. That people believe they are empowered by AI while actually becoming dependent on ecosystems controlled by a handful of corporations. And when I refer to corporations, I'm referring to the fact that, the infrastructure, the data sets, the platforms, and the compute power are still largely controlled by companies like Microsoft and Google and OpenAI. So, like, can architects truly claim agency if the tools shaping the future of the profession are ultimately controlled elsewhere?
So it's a general purpose technology that we have, which means, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't need to belong to a corporation. If an architecture designer learned what deep learning is about, they'll immediately be like, oh, I can deploy that on my computer. I can use it today. And if that's the case, you can then also change the way that you use the technology and completely have an agency over it. It's not very different to the different types of cars that you have available. You could go and buy a car and support a large corporation that's manufacturing it. You could also potentially support a local supplier, although we don't have that being in a South African context. But then you could also just make your own car because you sort of might have a mechanic that knows how to build a car. Now you might say, yeah, but that's inefficient or whatever, but that is the cost that you have to think. Do I build or do I buy? And you've got to weigh out those options. So I think, in my opinion, if you don't want to rely on a large corporation, you have to upskill yourself. So myself, for example, I believe in agency quite strongly, and so I've mentioned to you, I went to study artificial intelligence and I studied computational systems in it, and I attempted to look at how can I better understand it so that I don't lose my agency and so that I can also be a person that can shape it. Because as long as architects and designers and people who are creative say, oh, that's too difficult, I don't do maths, I don't know what's happening, what is statistics about, as long as we do that, it means you are always leaving someone else in control of your own fate. The gift that creatives have is to make the inaccessible accessible. You and I often say it that I think it's a moral obligation for every creative to learn a difficult science so that they can then translate it to the world and make it accessible through their art form, to whatever it is they're doing. Because that is what creatives do. They make things that are difficult for people to see, understand, realize. They make it accessible. And I think that is a responsibility creatives have, to be able to understand these things and then help shape the world in the way they think is representative of themselves and the people that they are representing. So if you don't get involved in these things, I'm not saying you must use the technology, I'm saying you must understand the technology. And so you can, if there is something going wrong, you will have enough knowledge to know how to resolve it, or at least get the backing you need to change it, because you can explain this to other people. You can be a translator of sorts. It's also just generally good to understand things, because then you are empowered. From understanding is empowerment. That's my view on it, Merylene.
And no, thank you for sharing that. And I think it comes back to what we've been like, constantly saying, responsibility. Because
Yes, fully.
yeah, because I mean, using the tool itself, you create a design, and if the AI assisted design feels socially, environmentally, or technically, who carries the responsibility? They'll ask, is it the
Yes.
architect, the software, the data set, or the client, or whatever? So if
Yeah,
we're
sorry, Mary.
using,
It's a
yeah,
good point. I just want to add to that. Machines don't have endowment. It means they're not recognized under the law as people. So that means people will always have to be held responsible. You can't hold a machine responsible for a thing that it's doing. And so that will always be a universal statement, because it's not, a machine wasn't given birth to by a human biologically, but human beings are. And so you will hold corporations and people accountable for it, because there's people behind it. Sorry, I cut you off again there, but that's an important point to make. You will always be responsible at the end, whether you use the technology or not.
okay, that's important to note. So I just got a few more questions. I'm aware of time, and we want to get into a discussion further, deeper beyond the things we discuss with
Okay.
the audience. So let's delve a little bit on AI and creativity, right?
Mm.
AI creates, like, generates thousands of design options in seconds, right? Would you say, does abundance actually improve creativity, or does it flatten originality? Because sometimes limitation is what forces deeper thinking and intuitive creativity, right? And creativity and human intuition is something that is seen from the divine. It's an aspect within ourselves that, ties back to our spirituality, or the metaphysics, or the inner intuition and divinity. So, do you think that AI risks in creating architecture that is visually impressive but intellectually shallow?
Remember, I mentioned it is a statistical method of producing what looks meaningful to you. That doesn't mean that it has meaning. That means a human being will see it and interpret a meaning from it, because it just shows you representation of information. So you spoke about abundance. I think it depends on you as a person. Some people thrive under constraints, other people feel suffocated by it. If you are a person that thrives in constraints, then you will have to attempt to manage your way in a world where you find limitation in a world of abundance. And if you are a person that thrives in abundance, you will most likely be very successful at what you do. What often happens is when you have so many things, it becomes difficult to make decisions. But many people see that as an opportunity. You're like, wow, I can make now so many decisions, and they learn to refine their decision making skills. So the advice I usually give to people is you should learn programming, not so that you can control software, because programming, specifically learning logic, helps you make better decisions. If this, then that. And many, I see that some of the guys who are here are from my built environment deep learning program that I run. It's actually been advertised on SACAP this week. It was a pilot program we run, but there they learned programming, first principles thinking. That's actually a really important point I must mention. First principles thinking, I'll get to it just now, is so core. If you ever listen to any of the very large uh, businesses and why they success and why they scale, it's because of first principles thinking. But I'll get to that just now. So first principles thinking, programming to help you become competent. that is the stuff you should encourage. First principles thinking really is about trying to understand where something came from, what's the logic of where it processes and where's it going to. But it's actually a mathematics term, and I first encountered it when I did calculus in high school, and I thought it was the most interesting idea because you can derive information. But if you attempt something from first principles, it means you are really looking at ontologically what is the truth of the matter. What is this thing? And if you can fundamentally understand what is architecture from a first principles perspective, so you can derive solutions, then now that you know how to do that, you need to learn programming to help you make better decisions to create it. First principles thinking is the method that allows you to innovate when everything else is changing around you. You're like, I know what architecture is. It's just different mediums through which it's expressed now. Because before, for example, the medium was stone, then it became glass and steel, or whatever the case is. You can see with every revolution, what's a new way to express architecture. I might argue with you that architecture is now the stuff you see on the screen, the user interface that someone has created for you to mediate with a computer, that can also be seen as architecture. But the point that I'm sort of just trying to make here is creatives will find a way. Across history, they have found a way, but it depends on the type of creative you are. And I think it's fundamental that creatives understand things on a very deep level and then learn the mechanisms to navigate that depth of thought. Because depth is a personal thing. Many people believe depth is because you're intelligent. I don't think that's true. You can have emotional depth and transfer that emotional depth into the other things you do. You often find that people that are good at one thing are actually good at many things. You might only know the one thing that they're good at, but the depth of their skill gets transferred into other places. And so I don't think it's a hamper in any way. I think it's a call for people to think more deeply and to then make better decisions or learn the art of better decision making.
So maybe Akhil, could you personally from your experience share like how AI generally improved your architectural thinking and where it might have made design worse and made it worse for you? Maybe just share a little bit of your experience with us.
Right. So in at some time ago, I was writing curriculum in architectural education. I have been fortunate enough that at every stage of the architectural journey, I have attempted to take the problems on myself and solve them. So one of the problems I saw was that our curriculum was lacking in financial literacy and in technological endeavors. And so I wrote curriculums to address this problem. I actually wrote undergraduate qualifications. And I still do a lot of that work. And so when I first encountered the value of taking strange ideas like programming and architecture, which people don't think is related, but it deeply is, artificial intelligence showed that this was a thing that could exist. I already knew that before AI, and what got me concerned was, wow, this thing took the value that I usually have combining disparate ideas together and did it for me much quicker. It took me 10 years to come up with those ideas. And I just mentioned these two strange things and asked how they connected, and it showed me. What it did, what was valuable to me is it verified things that I already knew. It gave me a confidence to be like, okay, cool. And this is not a biased thing. I'm not talking about you telling ChatGPT, make me feel good about yourself. I'm giving it independent data and saying, what do you make of this? And when the things that it made were in line with what I had, it confirmed what I knew, and then I could challenge it further. And so what I started to do is create robust arguments through what you call a Socratic method. It's not about who's right or wrong, it's about how close to the truth are you. And I've done this for many things. I've attempted to use it to help reinvent the voluntary association of the future, which is what the work I do at Cybid. I've used it to attempt to figure out business models and what could potentially work and what might not work. I've also used it to figure out very gathered data from very difficult things. So, for example, if you had a log of transactions, banking transactions that were done in a business, and you put it into a large language model, not one on the internet so that everyone knows your data, one that you might have in your computer. It'll pick up data from you very quickly and tell you what are the behaviors of this. You don't have to say who it was. You say, this is a statement. What can you tell me about this person? It'll tell you very accurately what are the behaviors associated with a person whose bank statement reflects this way. And it can tell you how they can improve it or what can they do to fix their problems if they have any at all, or what they should continue with. Now, I've used it in all these capacities to extend my thinking to help me make better decisions. So with architecture, it definitely helped me prevent some mistakes that I could have made. And some things that I'd say it was bad for, I think I genuinely know where its limitations are, and so I know where to draw the line. And so I haven't specifically found failures because I don't go in with a method of, can you do this, can't you do that? I know its capabilities and I know its limitations, and I approach it in that way. And so I generally know more appropriately when to use it. I don't go to use it when it shouldn't be used, when it is going to give me a bad result. So I don't know if that answers it sufficiently, but
Yeah,
that's the
I
best I
think
can
it
answer
does.
it.
It's giving us an example of where it worked and where it didn't work in your life personally. So,
Yeah.
people can reflect on that and see how they could use it in a better way. But so before we go into our discussion, I just want to hear a few more thoughts on a few more questions.
Right.
Let's focus a little bit on the architectural education in the future, right?
Yeah.
So, what worries you most about how architectural schools are preparing students for this shift? Because I don't think we are prepared enough. And should students still spend years learning traditional methods of drawing, presentation, and design thinking if AI can assist with most of these processes? Or are these foundational struggles still essential to develop critical thinking and spatial understanding and architectural judgment? So what are your thoughts on this?
First principles is the way. I think first principles thinking should be compulsory at all schools. A good friend of mine, my superior to me when I was in academia was Mario Hugo, and he mentioned ethics should be a thing we all study. I fully agree with that. And then I think that the methods through which to create architecture should always be known. It doesn't make sense to say, oh, we don't need to know how to draw. That's a silly argument to have. That's how we've done it before. You don't need to know CAD, you don't need to know BIM. What do we know that for? The idea of learning those things is not because of the skill, it's because of the thinking around it. What happened when you draw? What thoughts occurred to you? What are the difficulties you experienced? With CAD, how did that improve on drawing? What did it not do with drawing? Is it something completely different? Those are not necessarily a linear path, drawing to CAD to BIM. There are many things that are unique about each case that surround them. There's value in all of them. So to learn it is not to say that you must know how to be competently skilled in it. To know it is to understand its value. That's what you should be teaching. What is the value of these things? Because in life, when you have a problem, you have to find solutions that are multifaceted. What is the value of knowledge from different places that you know that can help solve specific problems? So I think first principles thinking is a definite must. Ethics, programming, or what you might call discrete mathematics is for sure. And then the ability to critically judge and make decisions, which also leads to programming. I think those are fair things to make. And then I think a lot of architecture education needs to, in my opinion, um, creatives in general, not just architecture education, creatives' work is very difficult to quantify. I mean, it's very difficult to quantify. It means people don't know how to pay you. Your economic model is very difficult. So I think what actually needs to happen is all creatives need to do a course in economics, and they need to be able to understand how to make a viable business model for creating things so that when they get out into the world, they aren't starving artists, but they are people that are empowered to see their vision by rallying resources around it. Because if you don't have the means, resources, you can call that money, sustenance, whatever you want to call it, wealth, privilege, whatever you want to call it, if you don't have those things to make your goal a reality, then the creations that you come up with cannot be realized. So a fundamental sense of economics and being able to make something real through using money as a resource to do that is pretty important for all creative education, not just architecture. So I think those maybe cover the fundamental things that I think should be covered in schools of architecture. And I actually do this. I actually work at many of the private schools of architecture to help shape thinking. Um, the most recent one I had done was at Inkscape and School of Explorative Architecture. Sorry, also in Stadio, where the School of Explorative Architecture, as sad as it is the first place in South Africa and maybe the African continent that we had a module on AI and machine learning in 2020 last year. And I say it's sad because I could be like, yeah, we did the first one. But it's so sad that architecture education hasn't embraced that. how can it be that almost 2 to 3 years after the whole AI revolution of deep learning has come through to the public after ChatGPT and Midjourney, how can it only be that 3 years later, I am the one that has the first machine learning and AI module in the country or on the continent for the field of architecture? That's extremely sad. That means that if the School of Explorative Architecture didn't exist and didn't allow these frames of thought, we might still not have had it. And that means our architecture education is to some degree failing us. And so those are my thoughts. And I mostly work with the private schools of architecture because they are very keen on looking at how to get people market ready. And so that is, and they're very keen on they don't have as many bureaucratic processes as a public institute might have. Although public institutions for higher education are excellent, there's no doubt about it. It's just a very slow moving machine. Sure, I said a lot there, Merylene.
No, I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting to understand the context of it because you are in the field and how you're adapting and using it. So it gives a broader perspective on things. So, Akhil, I'm going to ask you my last question for the final dramatic finish to our podcast conversation.
Okay.
And then we'll move on into discussions. So if we had to fast forward 15 to 20 years from now, right?
You.
What kind of architect survives this transition? And maybe the deeper question behind this entire conversation is in the age of AI, who really designs? So, what are your thoughts on that?
I think my immediate answer is Merylene. You're asking me based on the knowledge I'm telling you, and I'll tell you what my projection is, but I really don't know. And so based on my projection of what I'm telling you, I think the architectural designer will be someone that is capable of really straddling between the fields of science, technology, um, and construction with some artistic flair in it, right? I don't mean to degrade the arts in any way. Maybe what I should rather say is I think all of these methods together, a humanist element with technology is definitely what will drive it forward. And you might say, yeah, Akhil, that's such a shallow answer. That's what architecture already is. I think architecture is not at this moment science-based. I think it is not mathematically rigorous. And I think most of the risk that we have is not based on us making sure that the structures we create are viable as structural solutions. A lot of people see us as image makers, as form finders, and that's not a problem. That's a skill that had needed to be developed, and that as an economic model had value in the 70s. Right now, what I think it is that architects won't be confined to buildings, in my opinion. I think they will have moved out into various other places. And the example is myself. I left the field of architecture. Although I'm doing stuff in architecture, I have actually left the field. My job is to translate the difficult concepts from artificial intelligence and machine learning to creative communities or those who don't know much about AI so that it's accessible for you to understand. And that's what I do at the Institute of Building Design. I try to make these really difficult concepts easy to access so that you can use it for what you think is necessary. What I think is when people say the architecture of something, they say, oh, look at the architecture. They really mean look at the structure of it. And architects are really good at ordering chaos and figuring out structure from systems. I think architects will start off, in my opinion, having an architectural education which gives them a really good base, because it is an excellent education, a really good base of the sciences, of the humanities, of physics and the construction around it. And they will move into other fields because they will begin to realize my value is not just in the construction of buildings, but it's in how I can make chaos into order, whatever that means, whether that's writing curriculum, whether that's designing clothes, whether that's trying to write a software, whether that's allowing you to have scientific breakthroughs. I think architecture will become a platform for people to move into other things. It'll just be a base. It's not going to be the thing that everyone attempts to do. But that's my opinion, and I'm sure a lot of people hate that opinion. Whatever the case is, it's not about what you like or hate, or what I like or hate. Just based on what I'm mentioning, this is where I see it going forward.
That's an interesting perspective. And I think that's a good way to end our conversation. So,
Really.
thank you, Akhil. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your insights. And I hope our viewers have found this very educational, insightful, and inspirational, but also to see a broader perspective on things. I mean, we're not here to say, hey, AI is great, use it, or AI is not great, don't use it. But we're here to give a broader perspective and understanding and a different view on things so that you can see whether it works for you, doesn't work for you, or how you could improve, or you know, see how you fit as an architect in the profession and how it influences your profession. So um so let's open up this space now to engage a bit more and have more discussions, because I'm sure many of our viewers, you may agree or disagree with what has been discussed, but you have thoughts and reflections around it, and maybe you've had personal experience that you want to share. So I open up the space to ask you to ask a question, share some insights or comments or reflections. So please feel free.
I am also not going to shoot anyone down for anything. I think one of the feedback I usually get is, Akio, you're a bit intimidated to ask because you sound like a bit deadly. So I will do my best to answer as best I can. Um, I think maybe Kimera, you can also just check in the chat if there were any questions that came through, and raise of hands might also work. I think in terms of the questions.
Okay, great. We have a person that raised their hand. Dual Advisor. I'm sorry, I hope I said your name
Dear Wolf
correctly.
Visser, that sounds
Yes,
like a
yes,
familiar
yes.
name.
Please go for it if you
Hi,
can unmute
Akhil.
yourself.
How's it going?
Dear Wolf, how's it? Very nice to hear from you after a long time.
Yes, it's been a while. My question forward slash comment to everyone is that how can we make architecture? Oh, sorry. How can we make AI in architecture a profitable tool or a tool to make us more money in a less amount of time. In my company that we work for, we use Nano Banana to churn out a well thought out images uh, that actually make sense to the inputs that we give it. And it has helped us a lot to communicate with a client that has a preconceived idea of what he wants in this big development. So yeah, I was just wondering on the thoughts you may have on how can we make AI, how can we use AI to make us more money in this industry?
It's a really good question, dear Wolf, because I've been grappling with that primarily. I used to run the AI unit at Toyota, and it's one of the things I was attempting to find out as well. And I generally have been grappling with the question for a while. So I mentioned that at schools of architecture that we should learn an economics framework. And I found a very valuable economics framework to view the field of architecture through is through startups. They teach you a thing about unit economics, and it means more or less what is the value that the thing you are creating adds to the economy. And that's to say only what you have of value is what moves the economy. So if you are saying that, okay, in my firm, we like to do a specific thing, and that is to put title blocks on pages. Is that the thing that actually is the economic engine behind it? A good example is with McDonald's. You might buy burgers and whatnot from it, but that's not what its economic value is. McDonald's economic value is that they own property around the world. That's the economic engine that they have. And so what has to happen is from a first principles perspective, if you have a business already functioning, you need to determine what is its economic value. You might have an architectural business, but its value is not in the architecture. The value might be, oh, maybe why we have a business is because developers trust us more than other people because someone in our firm had a good relationship That's the economic value, trust. Or the economic value might be, well, we are able to get municipal plans approved very short or in a very short amount of time. That is the economic value that you have, because people will pay to get things done faster. The economic value is not that you produce good architecture, contrary to what most firms feel. It is something else. And the only time you can really know that is by interrogating from first principles, what is it that your business actually does? I'll give you a good example. I had the organization an architect, and for a long time, what we did was provided content, educational content, to universities, textbooks or whatnot, as you may know, Devolt. But the value in it, as it progressed, when I tried to deduce it from first principles, was that we could aid people with PPE, CPD, and RPL. And with that being said, recognition of prior learning. With that being said, the economic value is in compliance. So an architect functions as a compliance engine. That's its economic value. That's why it makes money. It's not because we have educational material, or it's not because we have consulting with firms. It's because we can help you be compliant in whatever way that is. So I think that using artificial intelligence is, you can, if you can help AI figure out your business from first principles. It's actually a thing we do in the Institute of Building Design. In the 5-week course, some of the guys who are here will mention to you, in the 3rd week, from first principles, we derive what is the value of the business you're working at. Because in the course, it's not how do you use ChatGPT or Gemini, it's here's what artificial intelligence is, almost definitively. Now, can you figure out from first principles what is the problems you have in your company? And now that you know what AI is, can you use it to solve those problems? That's how I would say you use it, because artificial intelligence can help you simulate potentially what it is until you get to the solution. A lot of people attempt to say, I'll build an app for that. I don't think that's a smart way. The app will come if that's a thing that must be built. Sometimes it's a matter of people. Sometimes it's just a matter of a people discussion that you need to change in your company that will activate more profit. But a good understanding of economics will help there, especially in the startup scene. I actually am part of a very large startup community called Founder Institute. They were the people that originally backed Udemy, and I learned a lot from there, from people that run very, very successful businesses. And this is one of the key findings I found from there. Dearwold, I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did, Akheel. Thank you.
Okay, cool, Dearwold. Thanks for engaging. It's very nice to talk to you after a long time. Merylene, go for it.
Yeah, we've got like 5 minutes left. So guys, anybody else wants to ask Akheel a question or share anything, please feel free.
While we may be waiting for some questions there, Merylene, I think part of the discussion is also important that whatever you ask has the potential to change some policies that are written around AI in South Africa. Or at least some infrastructural things. So I am part of a number of communities locally and internationally that are trying to form the basis of what AI is going to be for our field going forward. And so whatever inputs and value you might put in you will be represented, hopefully, if the arguments are good enough, in any of these very important discussions that people will have to follow in years to come.
Maybe Akhil, while we're waiting as well, maybe you can touch a little bit about practice and how they should engage with AI in terms of architectural practice, because some companies have been engaged in conversations, and maybe from your conversations with other individuals, is there anything to like highlight that people should be aware of and know of?
Yeah, I actually I've worked now with almost all the large firms in some capacity, whether it's speaking to the founders or whether it's working with some of the teams. One of the things I found is most firms are attempting to replace the rendering process, right? But as I mentioned, it's not rendering. If you're attempting to use it for rendering, you're going to be a little bit disappointed when you see a hallucination or an artifact, things that shouldn't appear in your drawings, because it's not a rendering so-called thing. It's not a tool, it's not a rendering engine, it's a probability engine. And so it gives you probable variations of the things you create. And so I often have to sit with large companies and corporations and just change the mindset. It's very difficult to change someone's mindset once they definitively think they know what AI is. very, very hard to change their mindset, because often the time I might tell you something that's factual, but because your experience makes you feel otherwise, I can't convince you. And so the best thing that I do is I attempt to say, here's my framing around it, attempt to use the technology in this way, and let's see if you get any better results. And usually that'll either help them change or say, nah, you're just talking nonsense, Akheel. I don't believe you anymore. But I think the most difficult part is convincing them that it's something else to what they think it is, because the technology is so persuasive. It almost overrides your faculties of thought. But once I maybe explain some of the mechanics and you really see the mechanics playing out, becomes a different story. Merylene, I also just want to make a few points. Merylene, I don't know if I covered everything as best as I could, but I tried to answer it with as much detail as I could. For what you've discussed, I hope though that the gist of the conversation was that artificial intelligence is a general purpose technology that can be used to solve many problems. I think that is a main point I'd like to get out. It isn't one specific thing. It's not AI for architecture, AI for this. It's not a software application that's a plugin. It is something that can be used to expand thought, capability, and quality and value of what you are trying to achieve in your life. That's what I hope comes through. And the methods through which we go on about doing that are debatable, but I do think that there's a much stronger way to overcome that. Just so you know, I think there's also a lot of economic value in it as well, because you are able to figure out the wrongdoings in your thinking that can help you gain greater economic value. Like, for example, what Gewalt mentioned. Gewalt mentioned that we're using it for this specific task. Gewalt can find other methods to solve those problems, which will thereafter increase inputs or outputs of the company. And that's greatly because Gewalt thought to experiment. Oh, I see we have a question from Assad.
Hi, thanks for your presentation today. What type of local platforms can be used to better train AI models to be more specific with the type of work that we do?
That's a very good question, Assad. Now, because we don't have that many people in the architecture industry that venture into machine learning and deep learning, we have a what you might say is a delay in information, right? We have people that don't necessarily create local things that can assist us, but that hasn't stopped everybody else around the world. What we can do that's maybe a bit better, in my opinion, is you should attempt to go to the open source community, and you can download from the open source community a number of different. So OpenAI has an open source large language model. You can download and use it yourself. You can also go to a number of other open source guys like DeepSeek, which is a Chinese-based model. You can download that. All of these things you can download from many of the large companies, and you can attempt to deploy that on your machines. But right now, locally, there are a lot of people working in the AI space, but not enough people in the built environment that have made something specific for our tasks. So really, what I'm saying is you have to go to the general purpose stuff and then figure out for yourself after you've downloaded it locally how it can be used for your own problems that you're trying to solve. Almost all the large companies have open source AI work. In fact, the whole of the deep learning community is an open source community. So you can get a lot of information for free and download things and learn it and create stuff yourself. In fact, at the Institute of Building Design, that is what we teach the guys, to be able to create your own solutions. It's not what's the right tool for this, it's how can you create a solution to your problems using this general purpose technology. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, a follow-up to that is, what would be the best multimodal open source that you could basically pull from?
I think if you look at, it's a good question that you've answered, but Google does publish a lot of their work. In fact, you can look at a lot of what Google has published, but Facebook Meta has actually published a lot of their open source. Almost everything they're doing is open source, and you can find some pretty high quality multimodal stuff from Meta.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Assad, for asking. Merylene, I think it's 4:01 now.
Yeah, I think we've come to the end of our conversation. Thank you, Akheel. Thank you, everybody. I hope you found it insightful and enjoyed it. And look out for more of our conversations that are coming up. We have a lot more planned in the next couple of months. And we have special guests as well. And we want to really create a space where we can have, open, honest, critical conversations around the profession and to see how we can transform the profession, transform society, and, come up with solutions. So we have a lot of things planned for Tough Talks. There will be Tough Talk events as well. So we hope that you would support the space and be engaged in the space and look out for the
Thanks,
space.
Merylene, for having me.
Yeah,
Appreciate
thank you
it.
so much. And thank you, everybody. And have a wonderful evening.